The idea that language is required for consciousness is quite counterintuitive. You don't have to be a philosopher or a neuroscientist for this. We look at dogs and we think, okay, they don't speak English or Japanese or anything else for that matter, but they strike us as conscious. And nonetheless, there are two examples that come to mind that make me question whether it really is this simple. One is an often cited passage, so I'm assuming that you would have encountered it at some point. Maybe it's even in one of your books, but it's this passage from Helen Keller's autobiography where, for our listeners, they can look it up, but she says something to the effect that until she learned language, she wasn't conscious. She uses these words. She was not conscious. She just was kind of this bumbling around, reacting sort of thing. And she doesn't even remember her life before she learned language. And the other somewhat similar example is less particular and more general. And it comes from this observation that none of us has memories of being an infant or even an early toddler. And it seems like our memories emerge around the time we start to learn language.
Yep. That's right. That's a very classic observation. I think that it is true that language restructures memory. I think it completely restructures how we encode our experiences and therefore how we remember them. And I think it becomes, at the very least, impossible to access memories that are not linguistically encoded. And so I wonder if we actually do have some of those old memories still somewhere in us, but we don't access them. But nonetheless, the main point, my main answer to that is a conflation. That sounds to me like a conflation between consciousness and memory. Because you can be conscious for some period of time and not remember it. And come out of it later. So, for example, you're on a bicycle and you fall and you hit your head and you go unconscious. You will lose memory for maybe a minute and a half before the accident if you really get conked hard. It'll wipe your short-term memory before it can get consolidated into long-term memory. You wake up and all you remember is riding, a minute and a half before you hit the accident. That's as far as your memory goes. That's gone. That memory is gone. That doesn't mean you weren't conscious. It means the memory is gone. I think people often conflate memory with consciousness. And so when you get into a case, I would imagine like the Helen Keller case, that she was conscious in the same senses that we mean it, experiencing and with these rich self models and so on. But when language came, it restructured her memory and she can't even access what that was like. And so then she says, I wasn't conscious. I can't remember it. It didn't exist. But I think that's a conflation of two processes of memory and consciousness.
Just to make sure that I understand this, let's say I remember a scent from 3 days ago.
Yeah.
The idea isn't necessarily that memory is linguistically encoded, but simply in virtue of the brain coming to use and implement language, the brain itself is restructured and you just cannot remember any memories from before that time period.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
right.
Okay.
So there's just to give another really interesting example. So language is one thing that structures memory. Another thing is space, and especially your sense of your own spatial perspective. And there's wonderful work now on out-of-body experiences, which you can induce in people. And there's wonderful paradigms from Henrik Ursen, who induces out-of-body experiences in people and does these really weird tactile visual manipulations and makes people feel like they're floating far away from their actual body. And it turns out that your memory, your autobiographical memory of what happens to you when you are feeling disembodied is terrible. Like you can barely remember the stuff that supposedly happened to you because it doesn't feel autobiographical. And your memory structure is designed to remember you experiencing things from the perspective of your body. And so you disrupt that mechanism and the memory starts to fail. So this is another example of how, yeah, you're right. It's not the events themselves, like the smells or the touches. It's that they get put into a larger framework, and the framework is partly constructed out of language and partly constructed out of your spatial concept of who you are and where you are in the world. And so, yeah, anyway, that's my answer to the Helen Keller thing. It's a conflation of memory and consciousness.
And she's conflating memory and consciousness, even though she describes her pre-linguistic experience as being very much like a fugue state where she wasn't really a self.
Right. So maybe there's two issues there. One is it sounds like she can't remember it very well. And the other is that the content of it is different. And so this is something worth pointing out, that the word consciousness has changed meaning over time.
Is it possible, I know that I'm cutting you off in the middle of a thought, but is it possible that just as language learning reconfigures the brain and how we access memory, it also reconfigures what consciousness is like?
I would say, from the point of view of the theories that we're working with, there's a very basic built-in mechanism, and it's there, and it's not going to change. There are layered concepts on top of it that change. And to go back to the example of white, there's a certain way that the visual system constructs white or reconstructs white, and we're all stuck with it. But on top of it, there's lots and lots of cultural associations. Like we learn about brides need to wear white because it's pure. White is like the color you want to paint your walls because it's pure and clean. And then there's other associations that come in, that are cultural in all kinds of other different ways. And we all learn these complex cultural associations that change our emotional tinge that we put on it. But the underlying perceptual model doesn't change. We're born with it. So I think the consciousness mechanism that as we study it is probably just there. But there's lots of complex cultural associations. So just the word consciousness, the person who coined the term stream of consciousness is William James. And that was about 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago. And to him, consciousness was not experience. It was the content. It was the stream of stuff in your brain. It was memories and colors and thoughts and emotions and all the content burbling along. That was consciousness, right? And so from that perspective, yeah, sure, your consciousness can change because the content changes and your concept of yourself changes. And interestingly, I think what happened was around the middle of the 20th century, as computers became more sophisticated, and you had people like Turing saying, hey, look, maybe these things can do what humans do. People began to feel threatened because if consciousness is just a stream of stuff and computers can do all the stuff, like they can remember and they can make decisions and they can take in visual input, then maybe computers are conscious like we are. And I think it was out of that this other more modern concept of consciousness emerged, that you start getting the people like Nagel and like Chalmers saying, no, there's an extra essence. There's the extra what it feels like essence, and computers don't have that. And I think it was a reaction to computer technology. And I think one of the reasons why right now there's such a surge, I see a surge in the field of magical perspective on consciousness right now, of this almost desperate desire to make consciousness into something mysterious again, is because of LLMs. Because again, people are feeling really threatened by the computer technology. And so they're searching for an intellectual argument that allows them to feel that there's a magic. So these things, science is socially constructed, as they say.